So again, welcome everybody to the new session of our Work in Progress seminar. And today we have Max, who is presenting an update on his PhD project about the political imagination of science.
Yeah, thanks. So thank you for being here. So very much working in progress. And basically it's an attempt to bring histories of science and philosophies of science. And that's what I'm going to be trying to do today. And I'll start a bit with my motivation of this talk, but perhaps also the dissertation itself. And since tomorrow is March the 8th, day of feminist reivindications, I thought I could start with Donna Haraway and sort of try to situate my research, try to situate myself. And because I think it's important to understand what I look for in philosophy of science or in history of science, and also how I judge other people's work, depending on what I look for. And so, for me, it's important to look in philosophy of science ideas about how I should relate to different kind of political struggles that I care about, and so how should I act in the world politically as a scientist coming. Living in Belgium with a well-funded fund, foreigner but in a good position as a father, and sort of, there's a lot of questions that starts arising when I think about how I should act politically, how I should position myself, and so it raises questions like, should I be, publishing top-tier articles in top-tier journals to influence my peers? Should I be perhaps, joining Extinction Rebellion or an activist group? Should I be advocating for changing the EU and lobbying at the Commission, or should I, join a political organization more clearly? So those are kind of questions that for me are sort of driving a lot of my research, at least in the background, but sometimes more explicitly. So just to continue a bit with the motivation. The motivation of this talk is that fascists don't listen, and they do so violently, and capitalists pretend to do so. So my question is, how should scientists respond to this? How should scientists respond to fascist and capitalist politics? And the main message is that we need to develop and nourish, sustain a political imagination of science. And of course, this notion of imagination, as you might already suppose, is a response to Brown's emphasis on imagination. But I argue, I need to time myself, that we need an imagination that is both more realistic and also more ambitious. And against Kitcher, which he didn't talk about imagination per se, but I find also his approach to be unrealistic and naively ambitious. And so I say we need a third way, which is to develop this scientific class consciousness as part of the white-collar class, but also distinct, with similar historical origins, but also specific threats, specific conditions, specific also responsibilities that we as scientists have. Which is mostly related to our position, our proximity to power, and specifically state power. So I precisely want to delve into this relationship between individuals and collectives, and the relationship between those two. And so today we've gone over the motivation already, and I'll first address two main philosophical contributions to the values in science literature, and then I'll contrast it with some episodes in the history of contemporary Spanish democracy. Then I will come back to the philosophical discussion. I've picked these two authors because they have both been influential in their own right. Kitcher perhaps a bit longer because he's older, but Brown, for example, several climate scientists have already taken up his model of values in science and incorporated it in climate science policy. So we can say that they're both influential. They both situate democratic ideals as something to protect and to improve, but also as a source to make science itself better. They are both Dewey informed and inspired by Dewey, and they both situate philosophy of science as being able to say something about knowledge in society, which I agree with. as I said, it's work in progress, so I've mostly been reading them, and I know, for example, of Kitcher, there's been a lot written about him and criticized and praised and so on. So I'm also curious if whether my interpretations are any right, but also if some of the points I raise have already been raised or similarly or so on. So we'll start with Kitcher's Science in a Democratic Society. So the problem that he's trying to solve is the problem what he calls the erosion of scientific authority. So this belief in evolution in the US, the resistance to genetically modified organisms in Europe, but more generally the idea that science is not organized towards the public good. And so he proposes an intervention, a technological fix, in the sense that he thinks of ethics as a social technology. And basically, he says we need to discuss better. And his intervention is this ideal to which we should aim, or at least sort of shape our scientific and political practice towards, which is this notion of well-ordered science. So without getting into the mechanics of the ideal, because I assume that some of you might be familiar, but we can talk about the mechanics later if you want, is this idea where you have participants which discuss and decide the scientific agenda of society. Those are not scientists, but these participants are tutored by different representatives of society, the different interests of societies in specific themes, but they are also advised by experts, and the idea is to sort of to set the agenda for science for the common good. And sort of my interpretation of it to cut short is that he wants to socialize the politics of science, specifically in regards to agenda setting, but also at some points also in certification. And he gets inspired here by Feyerabend. But basically he wants to socialize the politics of science, which by that I mean to put science to use for the public good. And his main interlocutors there are those that defend scientific autonomy. And because I don't defend scientific autonomy, I didn't feel very in dialogue in some of the sections. Then there's 3 points that I want to raise, which is this notion of history. For him, the history of humanity is the history of progress, but in need of some refinement. The history of humankind is the history of ethics becoming better and more complex, but overall sort of patchy. So we used to own humans, used to have slaves, but somehow now we don't, and the somehow remains quite vague. And for him, that's progress. We used to think that women shouldn't vote, and now we do. And so this is progress, and progress where knowledge, specifically the notion of public knowledge, serves a role for this progress. But he emphasized that progress has been patchy, right? We've traveled towards democracy, but we should see it as a work in progress, right? Democratization rather than static democracy. And related to this is his Deweyan notion of the individual. For him, he relies a lot on Dewey's notion of democracy, not as a form of government, not as the sort of the act and the mechanism of voting and governance, but rather, quote, a mode of associated living, where individual self-realization is always cooperative. So our personal projects, wills are not, we don't do them alone, we do them through a collective and through participating in society. So it's not only that we have the freedom to participate in collective life, but that our self-realization, is constituted through it. So there's also an ethical aspect that arises, ethical duty of participating in the collective. As far as his ideology, I've labeled it liberal progressive in the sense that not just because he's very clear that for him the protection of private property and taxation are needed to improve individual freedom, and not only because he wants to eliminate social categories. For him, notions like class, race, and nation are obstacles for individual liberty, and that the only collective that we should sort of be participating is this dual notion of associated living. But I think also in terms of ideology, I think it's more explicit in the way that, as I said, he wants to socialize the politics of science, but without socializing the economy, without a socialist society, in short. And I'll come back to that point later. Brown starts at a different place, but it's and his ambitions are different, but there's something shared, the idea of conversation, and of course the Deweyan character of democracy. He says we don't have to fix democracy, but we have to be better scientists, basically. But while it seems that the ambition is smaller, but the problem is still quite difficult, which is if we know that the value-free ideal is a bad ideal to have, we still need to integrate values, and we still need to distinguish legitimate from illegitimate sources of values in science. We have to be able to say that Nazi science was bad and that feminist science is good. And so the way he does that is by saying that Nazi science is bad science and bad ethics, and feminist science is good science and good ethics, and sort of they interact with each other, they co-produce, he doesn't use that word, but I would use that word, they co-produce each other, they influence each other. There's an iterative process between epistemic standards and values. And I was trying to think of what kind of fix he's trying to propose here, and it's, I think, a very empirical fix. He says we have to treat values better. Values are not just something that comes up to fill the holes left by epistemic underdetermination. It's also not just about managing risk. He has published on this in a paper on that there's no priority to the epistemic, he says. So he says that values too can be researched. We can sort of put them on the table. We're scientists, so we have to discuss them, analyze them, and so on, and see how they interact with the epistemic standards. So for him, thinking about values and thinking about epistemic standards is really not that different from one another. They're both inquiries to solve practical problems. And so his proposal, stated very clearly, is the ideal of moral imagination, which for him is a way to become better, more well-rounded scientists. And a summary is stated very clearly there, but basically his ideal, you could say that it's the ideal to don't rush into things, don't be a scientist even when you think about values, don't be afraid of them, and be empathic towards others. His history is missing. He focuses on current scientists, and past examples are decontextualized, and I think that would be okay. It's a choice, a methodological choice. But my problem, and I'll come back again to this later, is that he reduces historical contingency to personal choice. With, for example, the idea that race scientists could have considered an alternative. And I think this is a bit problematic, so we'll come back to that. And then ideology-wise, I again think that this is a case of liberal progressive take, because he rejects class or any social category for that matter as focal points. He has feminist points, but overall he relies a lot on the notion of legitimate stakeholder, which is raceless, classless, and genderless. And so he said we should go case by case. We shouldn't prejudge the banker for being a capitalist, but we should go case by case and see, case by case. So what's to like and what's not to like so much, at least my opinion. For Kitcher, again, this I think it's this idea of socializing knowledge as practices. Despite the utopic character, I think it's something to praise. For Brown, he has been criticized, and when we read the book, we were criticizing him for the individual approach, but I actually think that that's something to like. He presents imaginaries as these transformative forces to address contingency, specifically choice as contingency. And I think that that's something to like, and my idea would be to try to see whether we can export this at a collective level. So instead of choices, we're talking about historical contingency. Instead of individuals, we talk about collectives. And I'd say that that's difficult to do it straightforward. And again, this approach to values and epistemic standards, I don't know if that's the right word, and he doesn't use it, but I think it's quite dialectical approach between values and epistemic standards. They influence each other, and also they are reinforced not by themselves only, but whether they have a practical use. So that's where his pragmatism comes into play. There's more things to like, but I didn't have time to go over everything, but we can go back to them if you want. What's not to like so much, again, I already mentioned some of those things. Kitcher wants to socialize knowledge without socializing society. And I think that while certainly And I agree with him that knowledge and power are related, and a more inclusive knowledge production is conditional for a just society. It's not the only solution, and it's not the only conditional factor for progress towards justice. I think that's the problem. He's concerned about equality, about representation, and this well-ordered science ideal is for him a way to maintain that. But he thinks a lot of equality without justice, which is rarely used, that word or that concept in the book. Well, at the very least, he thinks that equality will bring about justice, right? Is the afterthought. And then another point related to the first one is that the ideal, the well-ordered science ideal, would be quite costly to set up. It's a lot of organizations, politicians trying to sort of, if we imagine setting up the project, it will be quite costly. And I think he forgets that justice can and is brought about not necessarily by this sort of bringing everyone together, but also by a critical mass of citizens, and in this case, scientists within that critical mass. His notion of history, I think it's explicitly, well, I don't think, it's explicitly asocial. It's a history of humanity as history of ethics. He forgets any social history that has ever been written. And while he claims to care about making societies more equal, he invisibilizes and even demonizes the mechanisms of resistance to oppression. And since we are in the topic of oppression, so his vision of history is oppressors versus oppressed. And when there is an identifiable oppressor, like a dictator, people fight them, resist them, and eventually he says they overthrow them and almost inevitably become the oppressor. When he talks about this, he gives no evidence and remains very abstract. So his point is that we should not focus too much on identifiable oppressors, but rather think about unidentified oppressors, for which we need knowledge. So unidentified oppressors, like something that is lurking in the shadows, and we need knowledge to uncover it, to see how it works, and his science should be working towards that, to identifying oppressors, or those oppressors that we cannot put a name, we have to sort of be able to get more knowledge about them. And my problem here is that he pits, on the one hand, resisting identified oppression with public knowledge. And here there's a rich tradition that precisely does this, combine knowledge and fighting oppression, which he doesn't cite or acknowledge, which is the pedagogy of the press by Paulo Freire. And also, very fundamentally, he does not acknowledge that some groups might seek liberation without conquest. For him, it's just like this Cold War mentality of like, oh, if you become the oppressed, then you will become the oppressor eventually. And that's also problematic from a historical point of view. And then Brown, I'd say that his imagination is rather limited and wants us to mostly imagine alone. There's no interspace between individual and collective. He claims that his ideal can work for small labs, but for example, he never acknowledges the power relationship within laboratories, between a PI and a technician or a PhD student, which I think can definitely thwart individuals' imagination. And that combined with the fact that he focuses a lot on scientific inquiries, and he puts aside political and the social dimension of science. And the problem, as I said before, if I want to sort of bring his idea of imagination, which I think is useful for the individual level, what happens when we bring it to the collective? The problem is that in that sort of export, when we talk about the political contingency of scientists, which is what interests me, and here I understand contingency as a matter of unforced choices and historical context, for which we don't have necessarily a lot of choice. So neither a social determinist idea of history, neither a liberal notion of history. I feel like when we have that notion of contingency, his model does not do well. It does not do well because the outcome is that individuals are either very responsible or not responsible at all. And the example here that we have before of like that race scientist could have reasonably question racist assumptions, I think it's quite problematic. So my idea is to bring historical contingency under a different light and show how it's a bit more complicated than that, and so I'll try to bring my own examples contextualizing them. So far for having multi-analytically reviewed the virtues and pitfalls of these two contributions, and I want to see how they fare in regards to specific samples in the history of contemporary Spanish democracy. So we're going to change a bit the rhythm. So I'll discuss the construction of an actual democratic society. Spain in the 1980s and 80s and 90s. But before that, we have to talk about the Francoist dictatorship. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, on the right side there's some key dates. And I will just touch on 4 different topics. My historian friends will probably not like what I'm about to do, but we're not going to tell them about it. First one, the political ecology of the regime. So basically you have to understand that the regime aimed at a full control of nature and people for the benefit of the state. Here in this river, with different dams and different sort of engineering, civil engineering and forest engineering, trying to control fully the river flow of this river. The idea was to put nature to work through a very hierarchical, fascist, vertical organization of the state. No more. And this was specifically important from the autarkic period in the first part of the regime. Well, autarkic, but let's not complicate the things. Then from the 1960s onwards, Spain underwent an attempt at liberalization of the economy with a focus on tourism, bringing foreign currency, also aided by the Marshall Plan and other European nations. And especially along the Mediterranean coast, there was massive development with very little worry about the protection of the environment, very little land planning, a disregard from local economies, and an absence of legality, and even if there was legality, complete disregard. This just 2 snapshots. This is a bit more important, at least conceptually, is that there were imaginaries that opened and closed, sort of. The dictator dies in 1975, and specifically during the last years of the dictatorship, obviously throughout, but specifically in the last the years of the dictatorship, specifically 1975 to 78, as the dictator and the dictatorship were agonizing, there was a lot of high repression and state violence, but there was a lot of social mobilization. So there was a lot of imaginaries about what Spain should look like under democracy. And it was widespread that by the end of the regime, things would get better in many different areas. Culturally, for artists, for students. Here we see students in the organizing for the democratization of university unions, for workers, for environmentalists, for revolutionaries that wanted something beyond a parliamentary democracy, a full-blown revolution. And the idea that I want you to take here is that there were different imaginaries about what Spain should look like. And also, importantly, the active role of citizens, specifically young people, like students. But that despite these different visions, these different imaginaries, there was an overall culture of compromise. Francoist dictatorship main enemy was communist thought, and one of the signs that sort of the regime was ended was the legalization of the Communist Party in 1977. But it was kind of almost transactional, at least at the cultural level. We legalized the Communist Party, and we also forget the crimes of the regime. So the institutional apparatus was in charge of channeling those imaginaries and appeasing them, and it worked. The regime was dismantled legally from within, in a way also to prevent some of the most revolutionary images to flourish. And then finally, the last sort of point about the dictatorship, and now we enter already a bit into democracy, which is the pro-democratic character of environmentalism and inversely the environmental character of democratic demands. So on the one hand, explicit political activism, mostly as I said, communist activism, labor unions, pro-democratic movements and so on, they were heavily repressed as compared to the conservationist, environmentalist protests, right? The regime didn't think that they were so dangerous. So a lot of democratic demands were actually channeled that way. And also, on the other hand, so the converse of this is that many of those protests that today we might think are environmentalist protests, they were not self-consciously environmentalist, because most of them were claims, for example, about public access to resources, to clean water, to air, against toxicity, things that today we might think are environmentalist. At that point, they were kind of more generally thought as sort of pro-democratic neighborhood association types of demands. So what I want to do is I'm interested in what happened after this periods of high mobilization. As democracy solidified in the 1980s, this sort of imaginaries became concrete. As these utopian visions were kind of closed, it gave way to parliamentary politics. And I want to contrast two imageries involving forest, scientists and grassroots groups, exploring how they shaped the social organization of science and the epistemic tools that they used, and specifically how these two aspects were connected. The two are the birth and the consolidation of Catalan terrestrial ecology and a network of grassroots environmental organizations in the region of Valencia. So this is the first case study. So now I think I can slow down a little bit. So among those sections of society that had a hope for the future and that wanted to be active members in the construction of the new state, the new society, there were Catalan naturalists. And naturalists here are geographers, geologists, botanists, zoologists, ethnologists, and you can see that it's still missing the notion of ecology. And precisely this is a story of how ecology was constituted, specifically the branch of terrestrial ecology. And since the early 20th century, but more specific in the 1970s, naturalists, they associated themselves in the Catalan Institution for the Natural History, which was born in the early 20th century. And in the 1970s, the scientists to think about the role that naturalism should have in response to the environmental damage that the regime had caused. And so they first met in 1972 in a semi-illegal way, and then by 1976 they published the book here, Nature, Use or Abuse, the White Book for the Management of Nature in the Catalan Nations. It was a collective work of more than 80 people and very interdisciplinary. And we could focus every single word of that title, but I want to focus on the notion of management. And they wanted to emphasize the notion of management and not so much on protecting nature through protecting local species or making protected areas, but they wanted specifically some of them a rational overall management of nature. Why? As you might remember before, the Francoist political ecology was characterized by this notion of unplanned development. We just do whatever, whenever. And here we see the imaginative dimension of their science. In the book, Ramon Folk, the editor, he asked, what have they done to you, homeland, when you get where we've gotten the anxiety to inventory, to record, to protest, to preserve, to raise awareness invades any minimally responsible citizen. So here in this short phrase we see the crossover of several scientific and technical proposals, but also nationalist, emotional and ethical narrative that sort of come together. And I think it's fascinating because it's early thinking about the scientist living and having only experience in a dictatorship, aiming at changing the policies of what they thought was going to be a democratic state. So they are doing this before the democratic state was configured. And overall, this is a story of success. And I want to touch on two people who were involved in this success. The first one is Josep Maria Camarasa on the left. He was a biologist that would go on to work at the Ministry of Agriculture, the Catalan Ministry of Agriculture, on themes of conservation. And he brought with him the White Book. And I think it explains also the success. It was not that the technicians look at the White Book and said, oh, this is interesting, but they themselves, many of those young scientists became technicians and technocrats. Mostly in the areas of land and urban planning. After his stay at the government, he became interested in the history of science, and he was, in fact, one of the founding members of the Catalan Society for the History of Science. And so he contributed to the narrative of what it meant to be a naturalist at that time. And he wrote of the White Book that was a work conceived with rigor and seriousness, far away from tremendousness and ecstasy. Against the uproar of the environmentalist movement, they proposed a reasoned exposition of the facts rather than rambling dithyrambs. And I was reading that, I was like, yeah, serious in respect to what is the ecstasy coming from? And so what is this uproar? And of course, as I said before, they are answering the environmentalist movement, which is this sort of people organizing themselves and being loud, but also to the strong revolutionary movement of the May of '68 in France, but in Spain this was early May of '66, and which they perceived as anti-rationalist, and that's the tremendousness and ecstasy part of the quote. And someone who didn't like the uproar very much, and who was quite patronizing to the environmentalists, self-described as not really liking Marxist, and who really very much liked this serious approach to nature, was Jaume Terradas on the right, which we can qualify as a scientific entrepreneur, he is the person responsible for institutionalizing terrestrial ecology. He was a disciple of Ramon Margalef. For those of you who are not familiar with the history of ecology, Ramon Margalef was Spanish, and he was one of the main contributors of mathematical ecology and oceanography. So if Margalef, the master, was ocean ecologist, Terradas wanted to be a terrestrial ecologist. And Terradas' aim was to modernize forestry. For him, forestry was unsuccessful, mostly because it had no scientific approach, and not because it had been politically associated to the Francoist regime. Terradas was an opportunist. He secured funding from socialist, conservative nationalist governments, and even from the US government. And basically, we can talk about the details if you want, but basically you have to think of as an entrepreneur and really try to institutionalize ecology. He lobbied and successfully lobbied for the establishment of the research center, which today still exists and is very successful, the Ecological and Forestry Applications Research Center, established in 1987. And one of the landmark projects was the Ecological and Forestry Inventory of Catalonia. So if you remember, there was this goal, this anxiety to inventory in 1976, and then finally in 1989, 12 years later, it becomes concrete. And this was supposed to be a, quote, radiography of the health of Catalan forest. So the political ecology here, we could say that it's this rational, overarching approach to nature, the serious approach to nature, which required a massive data collection. It wanted to be comprehensive. So in practice, they measured hundreds of ecological factors in over 10,000 plots. The plots are here on the right. That's millions of trees. For them, they said, foresters have been doing inventories for centuries, but mostly based on cubic meters of trees. So the width and the length of the tree, and then you can calculate how much wood there is. And what they needed to know is not how much wood there is, but how it is produced. So that's what is called the primary production of the ecosystem. So we should not think about the products of nature, but the mechanisms of production of nature. So we should measure also the weight of branches, nutrient circulation, solar radiation, water. It was very comprehensive, and the project lasted 19 years. And the notion of primary production was not theirs. They based it on the system's ecology to ecosystems, towards which the master Ramon Margalef contributed to in his cybernetic manifestation of nature as a closed system. Right, we are able to control what goes in and what goes out. The fluxes need to be studied before we have the full control, so that's why we need so much data. And the objective here is to ensure optimal production, so that we don't run out of resources, but while still permitting growth. So very much the epistemic underlying the epistemic of sustainable development, which was born around these years. And this has been termed by Peter Taylor as technocratic optimism, not only because it was adopted by technocrats and because government officials might like this approach, as he has shown, but for H.D. Odum, one of the colleagues or you could say interlocutors of Margalef, but because this optimism on the closed system was, quote, constitutive of his concepts, methods, and organization of research. So to recap, the objective of this naturalist and then terrestrial ecologist was to modernize forestry, to make a good inventory to be able to shape decision making. So they were not only aiming to modernize forestry as a discipline, but the state. Their political engagement was by creating tools for management, and it was this technocratic political engagement that we can say they had. The political ecology was optimized control, this intimate control of the production of nature. Good. Second case study. So before I show some pictures of some of the pro-democratic character of the environmentalist movement, specifically in Valencia, where a lot of the environmentalist struggles started in the late 1960s. So the region of Valencia was one of the pioneers in Spain, and by the 1980s there was quite a lot of groups in smaller and larger towns. And so here I want to introduce you to three groups which are interconnected. The first one is La Casa Verda, the greenhouse. And this was a space, physical space, a place they rented. It didn't look like that. It was in the center of the town of Valencia. This is more their imaginaries again. So there was a space that held several collectives to organize meetings. And it was not just environmental. There was an anti-nuclear group, that was the biggest one, Acción Ecologista, a bird and nature protection group, Agro, which was mostly biologists, as you can imagine, an anti-NATO group, an anti-militarist group, a feminist anti-militarist group, and a pirate radio.
So this was a big building.
No, it went by days. It was a shared space, and so on Mondays we have an anti-NATO meeting, and at the center of it all was Fons de Documentació del Medi Ambient. We can translate as the Environmentalist Library or the Environmentalist Documentation Fund. And this was really at the heart. The symbol is, as you can see, a turtle with a bunch of documents stuck on top of it. And so the function was really to do that, to find, to accumulate, to classify, to give access to knowledge to all of those different organizations. They were subscribed to several magazines, sometimes for free, and they also got book copies. And it was important for them because they needed to be updated, to be informed that they saw it as necessary tool to transform the popular demands into actionable policies and have some good technical backing. And it was run by a professional information specialist at, again, the History of Science and Documentation Department. So History of Science comes back again as actor itself. And then the third group, which is La Coordinadora per la Defensa del Bosque al País Valencià, we could say the Committee for the Defense of the Forest in the País Valencià. This is still work in progress, but basically this gathered a dozen or so organizations around different, mostly small towns around forested areas in Valencia. And they basically coordinated among all of these different smaller organizations, and also at the state level. There was a lot of environmentalist groups, and so there was also aim at state coordination, which has also been shown that throughout the years it kind of collapsed. The demands of the Coordinadora were to change reforestation. They basically said we shouldn't use heavy machinery when we go into the mountain because that destroys the soil and causes erosion. And also one thing that they wanted is to switch from reforestations with pine to autochthonous native or local, as you want to call it, species like quercus, oak. We'll come back to this, specifically on the emphasis on autochthonousness and how they excluded pine from it, because basically they were associating the pine, which had been 90% of the reforestations during the Francoist period had been done with pine, and the Francoist foresters had not really looked at even the species sometimes coming from abroad. But they were associating the productivist aims in which the pine had been used with the autochthonous of the pine. I didn't recognize that the pine itself is very much native from the Valencian region, rather than the pine, different varieties and different species of pine, but very much autochthonous. And their actions was to do what they call pilot reforestations with autochthonous species. So basically they carried in their pockets seeds of oak, and they planted in different areas. It was mostly symbolic to raise awareness, but also they wanted to generate technical information about how to ensure that the reforestation with oak was successful, because there was little information to do that on the specific Spanish conditions. And so they produced flyers like the ones that you see on the right on how to conserve seeds, how to sow them, and so on. And they also organized workshops and promoted self-organization. The regional government of Valencia, for the most part, ignored this, and even at the beginning, the forestry services chased them in the mountains and find them because it was illegal to do reforestations. But eventually, in the 1980s, the regional government tried to co-opt this practice, and the regional government offered environmentalist organizations a sort of public contract. They said, okay, now you do the reforestation, you seem to be experts on this. And their response was, no, it should be you, the regional government, who does this. Their aim was to hold the government accountable. And so that's the kind of thing I'm working on now, which is this ambiguity towards government relationships. Because at that time, while publicly they are saying no to the regional government, they were taking a subsidy from the Ministry of Public Works for precisely pilot reforestations. And it's not about like saying, oh, they were hypocrites, because it's a bit more complicated than this. The aim very much was to change governmental policies. They wanted to remain also outside to be able to offer that critique, but they really much wanted to change state legislation and regional legislation. And also they were ambiguous about the need for resources for that organizations and those studies to take place. And then also another kind of action that they did was legislative action. So suing individuals and suing companies and suing the government. And in the 1980s, they are saying, we really need to do this, but we don't have the technical abilities, the legal information. Some of them were lawyers, some of them were not. So that's why they needed the Fonds de Documentación, the environmentalist library. That's where they got the technical information and the expertise. And then, I'll stop at that in terms of actions. And then, in terms of history, and that's again work in progress. So most of the organizations that were part of La Casa Verde, the greenhouse, they kind of disappeared throughout the years. Acció Ecologista, which were the anti-nuclear group, fused with Agro, which was the conservationist group, and they became Acció Ecologista Agro in 1987. And La Casa Verde, which is now there, it became the de facto headquarters of Acció Ecologista Agro. So my current question is, to what extent is this fusion between the anti-nuclear activism and the, say, bird-watching activism promoted a de-radicalization of the organization, and specifically the taming down of anti-militarist, anti-nuclear, anti-NATO struggles? And my aim is to try to track this de-radicalization through their engagement with concepts like biodiversity. it's 1992, a bit later, the Rio summit, and they have this ambiguous, again, relationship to biodiversity. Yes, something that we have to promote, but we don't trust the structure of the Rio summit, and so on. And also, I'm very much interested in, as I said, this move towards legislation, that at some point it was not just about suing the government, but becoming the government. And so, and some of the members, like Carlos Arnal, a biologist, environmentalist, and one of the members at the Coordinadora that we saw before, he in the early 2000s, perhaps even earlier, he became a member of the Valencian parliament with the Green parties, as well, and then again with a coalition of left Valencian and nationalist coalitions. So I'm very much interested into what they got up to, the success of this approach, some of the failures, but more than just this dualism success failure, how they weighted the need for support, economic support, for effective lobbying, and their overall anti-capitalist struggle. So how did they, my hypothesis is that there was a de-radicalization, to be confirmed, but I mean, it's not a random proposition, but let's say it's a hypothesis, and I'm interested in how they narrated their own de-radicalization stories. So I'll stop with the history, and now we can go back to philosophy and raise two questions. Are these episodes of science becoming well-ordered or disordered? So, in a major way, I'll say that this is science becoming well-ordered. The institutions becoming well-ordered. The institutionalization of ecology and of the environmentalist movement brought together a broader representation of society in decision-making instances at the local and regional governments, also at the national, and here we've seen ecologists entering Catalan ministries and also environmentalists entering the Valencian parliament. So of course it's not the ideal well-ordered science that Kitcher had in mind, because again it's a very highly idealized situation that he proposes, but I think we can safely say that we've moved at least towards that. From the 1960s to today, this process of institutionalization was both a success and a failure. Yes, we've put legislation in place. Yes, ministries have been created. Yes, there's more environmental awareness. Yes, we recycle. Yes, there's degrees of ecology, technicians, NGOs. A broad part of society is engaged and is addressing environmental issues. And the stories I am telling here are stories of success. Technologies are being built, data is being generated, policies are changed, and most importantly, leftist biologists are becoming politicians in parliament. But similarly, the institutionalization of terrestrial ecology wasn't without a loss. Yes, the Catalan ecologists produce tools for the rational management of nature, but are they actually being used? How are they being used? We can talk about that. This is also work in progress, but I think it's important. And then again, there was a transfer, and some historians have shown this. The environmentalist movement became empty. A lot of people become to hold positions of power, like in regional governments. Also, in many natural parks, they were first led by leaders of the environmentalist movement, not only in Valencia, but in Spain and throughout. And I think in doing that, they lost, not just that they lost the anti-capitalist claims, but it literally that there were not enough people in those groups anymore. And then a critical question that I want to ask myself, if indeed we see here a process of ordering, which is, did I pick the right case studies? I feel like, and I don't, need a counterexample of this ordering. For example, cases of scientists openly working to disrupt consensus, scientists spreading misinformation, working for profit-seeking companies. And then, I think more generally, we have to ask, okay, there is this ordering, there's this progress. Is there compliance for environmental law? Is Spain at a CO2 deficit? Or more importantly, is there climate justice? Are some voices heard more than others? Are we recycling instead of divesting from militarization? I think in the larger sense, we have to speak of defeat of the environmentalist objectives in Spain and worldwide. And I think this relationship between success and failure are complex. This institutionalization, the success in ecological thinking, in political institutions, if you will, this progress towards well-ordered science, actually brought a loss in the richness of democratic debate. By institutionalizing ecology and environmentalism, the most radical proposals, namely the demand to exit NATO and no military investment, they were dropped out. So I'm currently tracking what were the more radical proposals that were abandoned. But who should we hold to account of these failures, if they are indeed so? I don't think we can simply hold scientists to account. I don't think we can hold environmentalists to account. And neither I want to fall into this narrative that sometimes scientists employ, which is, well, politicians are not listening to us. And I think that's where Brown might come into use, or Brown remodeled. Because Brown allows to move from these grander themes to issues of individual responsibility. But I'd say that his approach to moral imagination does not allow us to establish responsibilities for individuals or groups on these grander issues about the institutionalization and de-radicalization of biology. And so I'll go through the two case studies again, not entirely, but just sort of try to summarize. The Catalan ecologists, the scientists, they wanted to improve the state governance towards nature, and they did so. They created this inventory, they built tools, they created a research center, and they did so by aligning themselves with the conservative liberal government that ruled Catalonia for 23 years, from 1980 to 2003. Didn't have time to go into detail, but we can talk more about that if you want. But basically, it was a liberal government that was disastrous for environmental management, and that has been documented quite clearly. So for the most part, the ecologists were not overtly critical of their policies, and rather Terradas himself contributed to the nationalist discourse by arguing for the need of a technocratic nationalism with environmentalist objectives. They effectively separated ecology, the science, from political ecology, and specific the state's political ecology. So now, can we ask the question, was this a failure of moral imagination, or rather, was it fruitful or unfruitful political imagination? Should they have known that associating themselves with a conservative liberal party wouldn't bring about the fully functioning, overarching, rational, pro-environmental policy that they sought? And contra Brown, I'd say, of course, this is very complicated. No, because I understand that compromises need to be made, and we can perhaps debate about that. But they did resist, or rather reform, the neoliberal tendencies of the Catalan government by reforming decision making. And they did so because they were in positions of power, so they were able to do that. There were at ministries, at research centers, etc. But on the other, I think we can safely say that we can distinguish a sort of failure of political imagination, because they didn't acknowledge the limits of institutional politics, and to a larger extent they refused to engage with and listen to social movements. And that is changing, though. In a recent publication, and also when I've talked to Terradas himself in person, he recognizes today, for example, lately he published something, and I quote, "Environmentalism is the only movement in the 20th century that claims to have roots in science, and together with feminism and social demands, it has a strong mobilizing capacity against oligopolistic neoliberalism that has triggered an unbearable growth of inequality." And this is new. This is Terradas as a retired professor, living in the times that we're living, and this was not the case in the 1980s. I think more importantly, while some ecologists are recognizing the need to address capitalism, and capitalism not causing consequence to Earth, but being the climate change being capitalogenic, as some have pointed to, this is not the case for everyone. And there's a lot of ease in which scientists are ready to defend capitalism in a this is very current and very widespread. This is the scientific talking head of capitalism who advocates for bringing bankers to tutor, to use Kitcher's words, on their interest, and importantly, we see very few resistance, even from what is supposed to be a leftist journal. And then we go to the other, to the environmentalists, to the Casa Verde folks. I'd say they have what I think is a radical political imagination. Radical in the sense that they went to the roots, to the logic behind environmental destruction, which is the capitalist fallacy of infinite economic growth, which is mainstream in economy. And also the imagination was what I think we can think of as fruitful. La Casa Verde as a space that physically held these people together. It brought together different perspectives in fighting different instantiations of capitalist logic. It brought together capitalism, imperialism, militarism, growth, democratic, anti-democratic, feminist issues, ecology under the same physical roof. And I think it argued that these things cannot be separated. And I think it's important because it showed points of historical contingency. It pointed to places where society can and they argue should take a different route, and it also pointed to struggles that environmentalists and specifically scientists can engage in. And I think that's why they confuse this issue that I said before about the pines, autochthonousness, and so on, and productivity, and it shows perhaps in Brown's terms a failure of moral imagination. They let some of these grander ideals unduly associate autochthonousness and productivity. But I argue that their overall analysis still is highly productive and transformative. And just to close, I want to close. Yes, so basically my claim is that the liberal progressive narrative, both of Brown and Kitcher, tells us, specifically tells ourselves, how to distinguish good values and bad values. It allows us to tell ourselves that fascist scientists are good scientists, but it doesn't really tell us how scientists should do what they should do in the face of today's fascism and how we should organize. Brown would say that a fascist scientist has a failure of moral imagination, and Kitcher said that it would be more important to think about unidentified oppressors. And I'd say we need something else, and that something else is another history of science. And there's something interesting about Kitcher's discussion of the different modes of what it means to be a scientist. He goes back to different kind of values attached to being a scientist, and he goes back to the Greeks and sort of goes to the different eras of humanity and different sort of values attached to it, natural philosophers, scientists, and so on. When he gets to the 19th and 20th century, he distinguishes two modes, and some historians have also talked about this. One is the notion of scientists as a community of secular priests, as a secular priesthood, which he draws from Francis Galton, who argued that the responsibility of scientists is, quote, to guide human and intellectual and moral life. This is the notion of scientists doing science for disinterested ideals, truth for truth's sake. And he contrasts us with the role of the state that had for science in the 20th century, specifically in the wake of World War II, where the state becomes interested to what science can provide, and sort of even basic science becomes like a dormant seed that needs to be supported because at some point it might be useful. And I think he does very well, Kitcher, in that he hints towards the idea that these two modes are not necessarily incompatible. They sort of carry on to our current notions of what it means to be a scientist. And I think it's very clear today, these are the two main modes of being a scientist in the 21st century. The secular priesthood, even if we don't abide by this notion of disinterested science, we still have this idea of we are all in this together, and if we're not seeking truth for truth's sake, there's an importance of remaining objective. And then again, the very inevitable fact of the importance of the state in sponsoring, directing science. And I think that to answer the question about how should scientists and science as a collective resist fascism, we need a different narratives about what it means to be scientists, beyond the image of secular priesthoods or intellectuals with a practical outlook. And so I want to offer you to end some images, which are not exhaustive, but I think maybe are sparking the imagination. And I also want you to pay attention to the dates. I already mentioned one, which is the students organizing during the Francoist dictatorship for a democratic university. Funnily enough, these meetings were held and supported by several priests of Barcelona, and some progressive Catholics were at the forefront of this pro-democratic protest. So to answer Kitcher, priests can and have a practical outlook, and Mercier himself was an anti-fascist. So it's just...
But like Mussolini at some point too.
So it's just, priests are not just showing disinterested intellectual reflection. The Science for the People movement, which originated as a defense against pseudoscience, but that had a more radical branch and acknowledged that the way that science and engineering are part, not simply passive spectators of oppressive regimes. It ended in 1989, but since 2014 has seen a revival, always linking social environmentalist justice concerns. The British Society for the Responsibility of Science that promoted community science, and here they were trying to figure out where a foul smell like rotten egg came from in a South London neighborhood. The feminist movement in France in the 1970s that advocated for anti-authoritarian and sort of a DIY approach to male contraception, promoting research and development, and that again in the last decades has seen a resurgence. The most badass historian of science, of course, Naomi Oreskes, herself becoming a testimony of the role of ExxonMobil in spreading misinformation. The protest in 2017, as Trump was elected for the first time, and again they are organizing once more. The actions of scientists' rebellion from Extinction Rebellion against corporate scientific publishing Springer Nature. The organization of students last year around the world, which are holding Western universities accountable for their role in apartheid and genocide. A movement based itself on academic research about how Israeli universities deny Palestinian freedom. And you might be thinking, what do all these people have in common? And they are all resisting in different ways. They are resisting different forms of oppression through different means. And some of them might not even like to be on the same slide together. Some are explicitly partisan, some are not. Some have state support, sometimes don't. Sometimes they are against the state, sometimes through it. But I think it's important to see the commonalities, and perhaps the most classic and obvious answer is that they are resisting together, collectively as a group, and importantly as a group of scientists. They are resisting becoming part of a community of secular priests doing science for their own sake. They are resisting becoming a cog in the state and capital machinery. They are using science, they are thinking scientifically, they are believing in science, they are doing so in imaginatively creative ways. They are resisting disciplinary boundaries, being politically informed, finding allies, forming networks of solidarity, and importantly, although perhaps not all, they are unapologetically identifying sources of oppression, naming fascism for what it is, naming capitalism for what it is. They are resisting, in the words of Marx and Engels, to be the wage laborers of the bourgeoisie. They are, maybe we can say, they are making science honorable again. So my proposal is that we need more of these contra-hegemonic narratives about what it means to be scientists. And just to finish, you might be thinking, Max, there is still space, who's going to go there? Any guesses? Of course, John Dewey and Margaret Halley, founders of the American Federation of Teachers, which today is the second largest labor union in the US. So to answer Kitcher and Brown, their intellectual mentor, he too was engaged in class conflict, so he also deserves to be there. Thank you.
Question or
5 minutes?
5 minutes?
5 minutes? 5 minutes.
for clarificatory, just questions about things you mentioned, so they're not at all conceptual
Yeah.
questions. First is, what is the white book?
Ah, yeah. So that, well, I don't know if you have to go there, but yeah, so it was a collection of essays, technical essays on the condition of nature in Catalonia around that time, and a proposal for different kind of management, and how legal legislation for natural parks should be made, what kind of research we need. It was a sort of like a white paper, but it was a white book because it was very long. Yeah.
And the second question I had is why Francoist people were so obsessed with pines? Because they're good for industry, or?
Yeah, so I'd say there are different reasons why. The first one is that during the autarkic period, they wanted to have the forest had to be productive. At that time, the forest was quite deforested. And when forests are deforested, when you have poor soil, the pine is one of those that is going to catch on. As well, I think it's also important to mention that the reforestation projects were huge. In 1955, I think 1 or 2% of the PIB, the GDP was destined to reforestations.
Oh, yeah.
It's huge, and so we have to also think of it as a way to address unemployment, especially in rural areas, because reforestations, not necessarily with pines, but specifically with pines, the technical expertise is not so important. You can learn it, so it was also a way of controlling unemployment. And another point I'll raise is that specifically in the north of Spain, there was a lot of commons where people from the villages could use the forest or the areas for different kind of for grazing or for wood consumption, and this autarkic idea that the whole country should contribute to the economic machinery of the state needed to put fences and say, well, these areas that used to be commons, now they're going to be used for state reforestations. Yeah, so I guess those are the reasons of pine. But I guess the most technical aspect would be how bare some of the mountains were.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting talk. It's a very important topic. I'm very, very interested into it. And in the end, you presented the dichotomy between secularized of science and state sponsorship of science. But I think that we are quite forward in the way of, I would say, a private sponsorship of science directly or through the mediation of the private sponsorship of government, of state, as it were. How does this require from us a change in paradigm in studying these issues associated with the political relevance of science?
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, so first of all, I'd say maybe I didn't mention enough, but Kitcher doesn't say that it's either like you have to choose from one or the other. He does say, at least hints at, and I think you can say that he says that they build on each other. There are different values, different images, and they are not necessarily incompatible. And I'd say, yeah, the private, of course, there's a privatization of science happening, but even you could say that this was also the case after the Second World War and even before. The state perhaps is more in charge of sort of overseeing that privatization and permitting that privatization. For example, is the case of the email servers that we use. It's Microsoft, right? We might be exchanging emails about the need to overthrow capitalism, but we're doing that through Outlook. And it's our university with public money that engages with contracts with those public institutions. What's the role? I mean, I don't know. I feel like at least we have to think about that a lot of our tools, even in the human sciences, are very much privatized. So yeah, the private and the state are very much, sometimes antagonistically, but very much coordinated in the privatization, specifically when you have specifically neoliberal governments like the one that we have today in Belgium and pretty much everywhere.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so it's a very broad question, I guess. So you talked the whole time about science and so on, but and in the beginning you clearly saw yourself as a scientist. Like you were speaking what do I have to do as a scientist? These questions. Rather than as somebody who is studying science, like sort of meta scientist or something like that. And here in this environmentalist kind of scientists, that's a very specific brand of scientists too, who are by topic directly involved in society. But I guess this is not representative for like the ordinary scientist or something like that, who is quite far from or farther from societal goals and more executing things that, at some point will maybe lead to some kind of societal effects, but it's not really...
Like a magician.
Sorry?
Like a magician.
No, I don't. So that would not be a scientist either, right? So there's, there are several groups that I would like to distinguish. People who are like us, trying to think about science, or maybe me in a more abstract way than some of you guys, but that seems to be a little bit outside of the main scope of science. And then there's people who are not, like almost the opposite, like very close to making change in society. And they are a specific case because they do science from their drive for doing science is ethically loaded almost from the start. And then there's like the ordinary scientist, just the average person in the science faculty you're going to talk to, who wants to be quite is not reflecting on science so much, and is also not directly having an impact or wanting even to make an impact in society. I mean, general chemists or something like that. And so, if we are talking about philosophy about science, isn't it sort of a danger to focus on very specific kinds on ourselves or on people who are at the forefront of what might make change, like for example environmentalists. See my point?
Yeah, totally.
And you said at some point it's related, at some point you said something about these are people that believe in science, that want to be scientists and believe in science or something. I'm not sure anymore about who it was exactly that but then the question is, what is believing in science? Do you believe in science for its own sake? Or as the way that this is the best way to convince people of your theoretical or of your political goals? Or, so is this believing in science entailing, for example, some form of, in the end, what's most important is for us to be honest and to have the kind of the best access at truth or something like that. Some people may go in protests all of their lives, but we want to stick to the facts, something like that. Is that part of believing in science? This sort of ideal of objectivity, that we should go to the archives and we should actually go study how an ecological system works actually. While maybe it might be more effective to go to a politician and make exaggerated claims about how bad the situation is.
Yeah.
You know, it's not one question.
Sure. But okay, I picked up on different things. So the first one about like what I mean by science in my case, whether I consider myself a scientist, yes. So there's two aspects. The first one is because I was trained in biology and what was supposed to be a fundamental science. I was interested in molecular biology and about the brain, and I was supposed to be neuroscience as a basic science. So I think that's why I still consider myself a scientist. And also the other reason why, and it's my conception of science. So I use it here kind of like Kitcher uses, right? He talks about science in a democratic society, and I mean, I still need to look into it because I'm not sure, but it feels like the way he talks about the production of knowledge and science is quite ambiguously the same. That's what it feels like. So in that way, I use Kitcher's broad idea about science.
So in that case, an historian is a scientist.
Yeah, an historian, a mathematician, a humanist, Islam scholar, any kind of academics. It's kind of the same as an academic. But it's true that there is different categories, right? Scientist, an academic, an intellectual, basic scientist, applied scientist, engineer. Those are different categories that mean different things, and it's important to be specific. I choose to use science because people can do science without being an academic. But of course, academics are my main audience, I'd say. And then about the fact of being ethically loaded, that some are more than others. It's true, some are more than others, but I just don't think there's no unethically loaded science. I think.
No, I agree. That shouldn't be a point of discussion. I think we all agree with that here.
Differently ethically loaded or differently politically loaded. Is there a danger? So how representative is the case studies I bring about to make claims about science in general, whether that's science or academia or intellectuals or engineering or whatever? Yeah, it's true. So for me, I first start in the history, and then so what I care about is the environmental concerns about science. So of course, I touch more on ecology, on biology, on perhaps chemistry to a certain extent, but not really. But yeah, I care about what centers my thesis is forest. So even oceanography is far from me. So of course I'm making generalizations. Also I'm basing my case studies in Spain, and we say the same thing about France or Indonesia or the US. That should be more the historiographical engagement with other histories that helps me try to transcend those case studies. So in a way they are not representative of science, but I think by engaging with different kind of historiographies, I think one can make some general claims about general historical developments. The aspect about believing in science, I was about to remove that. I thought this is perhaps the most controversial sentence of the whole thing, because I was about to remove it. But basically here, why I say believing in science is because, well, we're not going to go through it, because in talking about climate change, and specifically climate change, there is this very dualist, either you believe in science and you believe what scientists have to do, or you're a pseudoscientist, climate denialist. And my point is that you can still believe in science, whatever that is. It's an actor's category. Let's say it like that. It's an actor's category to believe in science. But that doesn't mean that there is I don't think there is a consensus on climate change, to be honest. I think that's pretty good. There's very different ways of addressing climate change. So you can believe in science, but still be against, for example, oh my God.
Now you've done it.
Yup. You might be believing in science and being an agroecologist, but saying, well, GMOs is not the way to go, gene engineering is not the way to go. And I feel like when we put this dualism of you either believe in science or you are Donald Trump and you're a denialist, things are a bit more complicated. Classic historian thing to say. And so for me, believing in science, the way I said it, is more of an actor's category. Yes, I can be very much against this more geoengineering, planetary management of nature, but still very much be, a scientist in that I believe in the need for being empirically founded, being able to perform your, this more sort of epistemic values kind of notion of what it means to be a scientist. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, sure.
Or something, yeah.
I guess, so maybe a question that is kind of related. I was wondering if we go to Spain, Spain, and we were thinking about other scientists like chemists or whatever, mathematicians or something. How did it go? Could they do this freely if it was far away enough from politics?
To do what? Sorry.
Just have science. How did science go in Spain under Franco?
Yes. Sorry.
If you have like really, if you're an environmentalist and so you're close to political action, I guess it's gonna be more hard. But if you're doing more fundamental science or something, or more things that have an economical benefit, or so that he could like rely on, or he could be proud of, Franco himself. I guess it could be possible to do decent science in these. Do you know how it went?
Yeah. I don't have it here. Well, this is good enough. So there was basically we used to have this idea, especially in the 1980s. Well, we had Francoism, and it's true. There was a lot of cleansing of university. There's a lot of people who went to exile of different kind of. You didn't have to be a communist to have to go to exile or detained, or you lost your position. And so there was this idea up to recently, and still some people have today. Well, there was just no science during Francoism, and it's not true. There was a lot of science, specifically engineering. So civil engineering was big, and that was at par with what was happening in the rest of the world. So there was no. In Spain, there is this idea that Spain is whatever. It's always backwards, and the Francoist regime was the last drop and of the bucket. But no, there was a lot of engineering, and there was also a lot of basic science as well happening. Well, not a lot, but there were some things happening, especially towards the end of the regime. And in terms of environmental science, there were some. I don't have it here, but there were some people who were trained in agronomy, for example. We just trying to make hybrids to make production higher, like was the case of in Mussolini's Italy. Make the crops more stronger. To make the crops stronger, and in Spain this was the case too. And some of those scientists, they had to navigate the repression and how to still be able to hold that position, to be able to communicate with people in power. So the history of conservation is an example of that, specifically since the 1950s. And there, for example, international diplomacy was very important. The case of Doñana in the south of Spain, there were some marshes, and the WWF was actually created in order to save Doñana. And so international scientists, they used a lot their international connections, like, oh, look what the English are saying, look, the Americans are coming, we have to look good. And actually a lot of conservationist proposals were always done in the name of modernization. It's like, oh, look at the English, they are talking about birds, we should also protect birds, I guess. This kind of thing. So scientists had this dual role of and some were more explicit than others, and some when Francoist died, they were much more explicitly revolutionary, Marxist, some others not. There was a lot of individual also idiosyncrasy of how to navigate those very charged terrains.
Thank you for the talk. It was really, really interesting. I had a question. In the philosophical part, you talked about, you raised the question of responsibility. Who should be held responsible for the institutionalization and the radicalization of the movement? Do you have any opinion or element of answer to answer this question?
Yeah. Yes, that I actually forgot to say it. Yeah, let's put it this way. In the case of the terrestrial ecologists in Catalonia, that they seemingly had very little problem to associate with the conservative neoliberal party that ruled Catalonia for 23 years. They were able to construct their discipline because they were very close to political power. When I've talked to them in person, they were highly critical. Now, in 2025, they were not so highly critical then. I guess internally, yes, but at least publicly, it was kind of fake. Or non-existent. Specifically because there was this need for science, the science of ecology, to distance itself from environmentalism. So they worked very hard to say, those are environmentalists and we are scientists, and there's no communication between us. And now they start to talk about this. So in terms of responsibility, it's always weird to do that as a historian, to be able to look past in the past and judge your historical actors. But I'd say that that it shows some sort of failure of political imagination to think that you can associate yourself freely with a conservative liberal party, and just by producing tools you are going to make nature management rational. And that they demonized sometimes the environmentalist movement, which now they seem, specifically Terradas, to say, well, it's good because they are the only movement together with feminism which is science-based. And this was very ambiguously said in the 1980s. So there's a shift, and I feel like there's a big shift because of the revolutionary movements in the 1960s and 70s. This was with the coming and the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s. And the Cold War, you couldn't be a Marxist anymore, and we see a depoliticization of academia, and now we kind of see that it's coming back again. Sorry, you were talking about responsibility, I started talking about politics, but I guess that's the main claim of the talk.
That was an empirical question she was asking. You were asking about this specific case.
Yes, if you have any evidence for this specific case.
So evidence about responsibility of science.
Of who can be accountable of the fact that they de-radicalize.
Again. Yeah.
But the fact that academics wanted to take a step back from politics can be a part of it.
Yeah, that's one say that because they chose institutionalization, both ecologist and environmentalist, it inevitably went to a de-radicalization. And then that's why I think politics is important, because it's not that they were fully responsible for that. There was a whole global process of neoliberalization that came with a de-radicalization of politics. And so that's why I say that it's complicated, that we cannot just hold them to account as like, oh, it was because the science they stopped reading Marx that then things bad happened. It's a bit more complicated than that. But in part, it's also true. That's what also happened. Scientists were very much comfortable talking about Marx in the 1970s, and they started doing that. And I think this. Well, I'll stop that. I think the science wars is an example of what happened when you stopped reading Marx.
Thank you, Max, for the talk. So your goal, true, of course, it's a empirical studies, but your goal is to increase to develop the scientific class consciousness of scientists, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of your main obstacle, I don't know in Spain, but it's the priesthood ideology that is still very strong among scientists.
Which ideology?
Priesthood, the secular priesthood ideology among scientists that will stop a Marxist interpretation of things. So my question is that do you think maybe it's maybe strategic, but
I like that.
Distinguish between the phase production of knowledge, the practice of production of knowledge, and the practice of expertise, so use knowledge. To distinguish the two roles, the scientists would be much more comfortable. They would say, okay, I can still be a priest with the production of knowledge, but of course the expertise part that I can do as a scientist could be politically very inclined and very class conscious. But in their mind, if you separate the two, it will help them to get engaged. No?
Yeah, I'd say yes, and I think that's
maybe an artificial distinction.
Yeah, I think to certain it's true. I think it's to certain extent in an artificial distinction, and philosophically and historically, I'd say that doesn't hold up. But strategically, I think yes, and we should think of strategically. And I think that. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. No, just the second one. Yes. So sorry. Science for the People precisely had these two parts, right? Science for the People movement started when there was attacks on science, and at the beginning started as an anti-pseudo-science movement, and there was one branch that was like, guys, we have to talk about more, just like deeply about how politics enters the very epistemic core of science, and that's where you got Levins and Lewontin and so on. But I think I'd be happy to share space with less radicalized but still politically involved scientists. So for example, I think one example could be scientist rebellion or extinction rebellion. I think they want to hold to certain neutrality and of science and certain priesthoodness of science, but they are very much engaged in certain kind of actions and so I'd be very much happy to share. So in terms of I don't think we have to all be radical. I think we need some critical mass of radicality, and that radicality for me is to see how politics enters the very epistemic core of science. But I'd be happy to share with people who want to make that distinction.
Because I don't want to discourage you and people like Kevin, but we're teaching scientists every year for decades. And it helps for them to distinguish. Okay, there's your practice that you can still be objective, whatever that means, I don't know. But, Or disinterest. Of course, your money comes from blah, 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 but we're scientists. We're in this very special community of scientists, blah, blah, blah. And on the other hand, oh yeah, when you are an expert, when you go in society, you change your cap, and it's okay. It's okay to have a point of view. It's okay to defend a cause with science data, science means, but to be engaged.
Yeah.
Which they would be super uncomfortable, even if they are, in fact. But to do that, oh yeah, when I presented my paper, I should put my engagement at the beginning, you know.
I've heard historians of science say that Naomi Oreskes was neutral and she was just an expert, and it was thanks to her neutrality that she was able to give expert testimony against Exxon. And I think this is the other way around. The fact that she got interested in those issues is because she had some political, ethical motivation. What I would say is that I might change my mind the day I start teaching engineers.
Let me give you an example. I was in a conference in my ex-university with biologists because I was hanging out with biologists a lot. And there was a philosopher, very environmentalist philosopher, very engaged, also a CNRS, also a researcher. And she said, this is my goal, it's blah, 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 revolution. And I'm going to look for the data that prove my point, my engagement. I've never seen biologists so uncomfortable, okay? Because of course they agree with her, okay? They agree with her position, her goals. They went in biology often for environmental reason, but the idea that you will be so engaged that you will look specifically for reasons that will sustain your position, that's outside the priesthood.
It goes against the objective. And what I'd say is, I think
But she was very honest. I thought she was honest. She was in a war against blah, blah, blah. And she will use whatever tools are available to win.
I think the key word is strategy here. And I think my understanding of political history is that if you don't have a radical movement on the left, you don't have a socialist party that is going to take on more leftist positions. And on the right happens the same. You don't have a movement towards the right of the center parties if you don't have Trumps and Tea parties and so on. And so strategically it's important to adopt radical positions, even if sometimes I am also a bit uncomfortable with that. Strategically. Sometimes I feel like me, where I come from a very bourgeois family, my parents are scientists, the things I'm saying, they are both uncomfortable with this. So I think internally I am also uncomfortable with some of the most radical things I'm saying, but I think strategically, if I think beyond me, I think it's necessary.
I want to rebound off of that with a comment that will sound more negative than I mean, but I can't think of another way to phrase it. So Brown's fix, right? Brown's fix is to do better ethics.
Yeah.
And I worry that you haven't taken him seriously enough. In the following sense, there's another thing that all the people on that slide shared that you didn't say out loud, which is that you agree with all of them. And that's not a bad thing. But imagine the evil twin of your presentation, right? Where this last slide is like burning the trans books by the Nazi regime, and like Donald Trump's executive orders canceling DEI, and like this is what we have to do so that science can be put at the service of the public good. Right? I think the only way that you say to that person that you're full of crap is you do the ethics. And you can't shove that off on the politics. That's what I'm worried about. What worries me is that a piece of the burden here that's honest to God ethical has become too political, in that somewhere in the background there looms the question of why these ethics. And I mean, Brown, Brown to his credit and discredit, right? I mean, Brown like knows that this is a problem and he tries to do this very complicated dance, right? Where he's like, wow, but pragmatism met ethics, and so we have some empirical historical evidence that feminism is good, which I completely agree with that. Like, I'm on board with that. I think that's correct.
But that's the easy case.
But that's the easy case. And so, like, what happens when we start to disagree, right? And when we have good faith disagreements. I mean, that's the other thing is that I think, the other worry here, I'm not worried that you don't have a counterexample of a case when the scientists were in bad faith, because there I think, and I mean, you can do this in a footnote, right? Like the agnotology literature has your back on this, right? Like those case studies are well understood now. Like we know what bad faith scientists look like. Like we get those guys. And we get their social and political history too, because like Merchants of Doubt is not just a philosophy of science book. That's a social and political history about how certain kinds of right-wing cold warriors in the United States decided to mobilize science for their own ends, right? Like that work is there. Maybe I guess what I'm worried about is what do we do when the enemy isn't like Franco?
Yeah.
Right?
But I'm also concerned about the good faith scientists. So, oh my God, we're not going to. Let me just pull it up.
Good strategy outside
You're paying for those animations every time you hit the button.
I'm also worried about.
Yeah. Okay. Good. These cases are helpful for that.
So the population bomb. It's supposed to be a good faith. It's like,
Yeah. This was good faith disagreement. Turns out we now think that these guys were misled.
Yeah.
But like at the time it wasn't immediately intuitively obvious that they were completely full of crap.
But I think the only criticism that I think really puts down the Ehrlich, the Malthus, the World Economic Forum, all of that, it's politics. It's to show how the population thinking about the environmental crisis is just doing a service to capitalist logic. Is saying, well, the problem is humanity in general, the problem is the Anthropocene, and then it erases what's driving climate change, which is not that we are many people, but the fact of how we use resources and conceptualize resources, how we conceptualize nature. What I'd say is that I don't think we have to choose between the ethical and the political, but we need to have both. That's my problem with Brown, that he chooses ethics, and I just don't think we need to choose ethics. And because the actors themselves don't choose ethics. I mean, this quote, doesn't choose ethics. Sorry, that's not the one. This quote doesn't use ethics. It's wild. They are talking about homeland. They are talking about anxiety. So they are also talking about emotional. Some people say, we have to address climate change and we have to think about despair and eco-anxiety. Some people say, no, we have to talk about the instruments and have technical expertise about recording, about inventory. And the actors themselves, and they are talking at the end about what it means to be a responsible citizen. So because the actors don't choose, they don't choose to be, now I'm making ethical claims, now I'm doing political claims, I think we have to go at it with everything. How that actually looks like, I'm not sure. It's true that I might miss a bit of ethics in my talk. It's true. And And that's what I try to do at the end when I sort of talk about responsibility and try to say, it's not that I don't want to say, yes, the fault of the sign of the institutionalization and de-radicalization of ecology is neoliberalism. No, because I study historical actors and I really care about specific people's biographies. And then when you start talking about people's biographies, they are always talking about ethics, about their personal point of view, how their life histories intersected with their science. So I think ethics has definitely a place, but we need to do both. It's true we cannot be lazy on the ethics and just do politics. And I think a lot of Marxist thought has, it's everything is society, forget about individual, it's just about society. No, we are, first of all, we are individuals. Our individual experience is inescapable. That's how we relate to the world. So that's why I think that
Well, and ethics doesn't just mean individualist either, right? I mean, that's,
so
collective values are a thing. And I mean, maybe that's what's missing. Here's a maybe more constructive way to put it. Maybe part of what's missing here is if you don't like Kitcher and Brown's ways of formulating it, then maybe what you need is an account of how what read to you like individual level ethical values trickle up into what read to you like political level ethical values.
Yes, and I think that's what I didn't like about Brown, but I liked about Kitcher, because I think Brown's ethics are too individualistic. It's not that his approach is individual, but his ethics are quite geared towards individual choice, by choice. But I really like Kitcher's idea that self-realization comes from being part of society, and that's very Dewey. That's we have personal projects, and those might be ethical projects, those might be political projects, but we don't do them alone. We do it in a society. So I think my idea would be to try to combine the collective dimension in Kitcher's with the approach to imagination, to contingency present in Brown.
I think doing that explicitly will answer my word.
Yeah.
But I just only want to.
Yeah, because I think now we're forgetting Dewey and all this tradition. So we're profoundly individuals in a group, blah, blah, blah. But still, Kitcher is a liberal, pure liberal. And it's why they talk about unidentified enemy all the time. Because they are obsessed by the tyranny of the majority. You say, they say that the oppressed become the oppressor without proof. They would say, just look, any time in history, since the beginning of time, each time someone won, they become the oppressor. Each time. Maybe you're not convinced by this history, but that's the way they read history.
Yeah.
So the unidentified enemy has a specific role, is that you try to anticipate in the deal, what would be some limits to protect a group from the tyranny of majority? And it's the way Kitcher thinks about it, and all the liberal thinkers think about it. But that's interesting, because often in your talk now, that the way you discuss is that it seems that the ethical is globally solved, and the question is at the level of the political. So, it's quite obvious, blah, 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 capitalism, liberalism, bad. Let's discuss how to get there and organize. But of course, that's not the way a liberal thinks. A liberal thinks says that we will never agree on the good. Okay? It won't happen. There will always be people with genuine good reason to disagree with you. So how do you organize the political, knowing that? And that, it's not that, one day everybody will understand. Capitalism is bad. No, maybe not, maybe not. So how do you organize? Because we will have to save the planet in a way or another together with the knowing that we will disagree about basic good. There will still be a guy that says everything is good is written in my book. God gave me my book. And that's it. You won't change, she won't change, and I won't change. So how we'll manage that? And science, how scientists who, I repeat, the secular priesthood myth is very strong. Scientists often, they say, my practice is outside politics and ethics. I live in this bizarre land, but I go down to the people to give my knowledge. And after that, the people refuse, and they're like, during the COVID, people are stupid. It's so ingrained in the way they are trained.
Yeah, it's very pervasive.
So I know I'm just multiplying the obstacles, but
No. So the regards to history, it's so cringe when I read Kitcher's history because it's just like no sources, no social history. I think that's it's
as an historian, it's unacceptable.
It's unacceptable. I think it's that's why I think it's antisocial, because he demonizes it. So I think it's not that he's asocial. He's like, oh well, I just do history of ideas. So I think it's he refuses to engage with any social history and demonizes by this oppressive thing. And so I think that's antisocial in that sense. And so, and I agree, I think the ethics has a huge role, and that's why I think at the beginning I foregrounded my ethical choices. So how I should live, this is not like sort of theatrical performance, a little bit always, but I really don't know if I sometimes should just, what should I do for my postdoc? Should I try to get a job at the EU and try to make laws? Should I say, you know what, I'm just going to get a food job, what do you say in French? Like a alimentary job to pay the rent, and then I should just dedicate 80% of my time to organizing? Or maybe I should just step back and say, I take care of my daughter, and then I let my partner, a woman, take on more a public political role. And I should just see science as a 9-to-5 job. And it's really personal questions about my ethics. And I'm not sure. And so at the end of the day, for me, those are very much ethical questions. And to the question of like, yeah, but it's difficult to really convince all these scientists who are thinking about that they are in some sort of priesthood. I think there is just no easy way. I think we have to do the work. I think we have to organize. I was reading the other day about some political organizer from Portugal trying to reflect on his experience. Like, there's no easy way out of this. We cannot raise consciousness by writing, by politics. We have to do the work. We have to distribute flyers, organize events. We have to organize marches. We have to do the work. What it means politically, concretely in university, telling our colleagues to join the labor union, organizing explicitly political events, at the level of students organizing among ourselves. I think the work needs to happen. It won't be there. You're right, but I also don't think it's unchangeable. I still believe in historical contingency a lot.
maybe you could add to your database of case the seminar on the transition that we organized here for years and completely failed.
What seminar?
That's a case that we tried.
What? Sure, later.
It's an interesting case study.
Yeah.
Because it's a failure. It's a real failure.
It is beer time.
Good.
So let's end.
Thanks.